Why won't you date me? The question floated through the crystal ballroom so softly that it somehow silenced more than 400 guests in black tie attire. Conversation stopped. Champagne glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. Even the orchestra seemed to lose its place for a heartbeat. Victoria Hayes, America's youngest billionaire CEO, stood beneath the golden chandeliers with a microphone trembling ever so slightly in her hand, her confident smile replaced by something far more vulnerable. Every business magazine had called her fearless. Every television network described her as the woman who never heard the word no. Yet tonight, before governors, celebrities, Fortune 500 executives, and the nation's wealthiest philanthropists, she looked only at one man sitting quietly near the back of the room. Isen cualquier no designer tuxedo. His charcoal suit had clearly been tailored years ago. His shoes were polished but worn around the edges. Beside him sat his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, who squeezed his hand without understanding why everyone had suddenly turned toward them. The spotlight found Ethan, but he didn't flinch. He simply looked back at Victoria with the same calm eyes that had first unsettled her months ago. "I'm serious," Victoria whispered, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "Why won't you date me?" A ripple of disbelief spread across the audience. Billionaires didn't chase mechanics. CEOs weren't supposed to expose their hearts in public. More importantly, no ordinary single father had ever rejected Victoria Hayes. The financial world worshipped her brilliance. Magazines admired her beauty. Powerful men competed for 5 minutes of her attention. Yet the only man she wanted had gently turned her down 3 different times without anger, without arrogance, and without explanation. Some guests exchanged amused smiles, already expecting Ethan to apologize before accepting the opportunity of a lifetime. Others quietly reached for their phones, sensing that tomorrow's headlines were writing themselves. Ethan slowly rose from his chair. He leaned down first, brushing a loose strand of blonde hair away from Lily's face before, whispering something that made the little girl smile. Only then did he straighten his jacket and walk toward the stage. His footsteps echoed across polished marble floors, each one measured, each one steady, as though he were walking in a church rather than into the center of America's attention. Victoria searched his face for hesitation, regret, anything that suggested she still had a chance. Instead, she found only kindness. It was that kindness that frightened her most. Ethan stopped only a few feet away. He looked at Victoria, then briefly at the audience, before returning his eyes to hers. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet every person in the ballroom heard every word. "Because the last woman I promised forever," he said, "never got the chance to grow old with me. And every night my little girl still kisses her mother's photograph before she goes to sleep." No applause followed. No whispers remained. Only a silence so deep that even the crystal chandeliers seemed to hold their breath, while Victoria Hayes felt her heart break in a way that no amount of money, power, or success had ever prepared her to endure. Victoria did not move. For the first time in her life, the woman who had negotiated mergers across continents, dismissed hostile boards with a single sentence, and stared down men twice her age without blinking, had no answer. The microphone lowered slowly in her hand, and the ballroom remained frozen around her, not in judgment now, but in reverence. Ethan Walker had not embarrassed her. He had not rejected her to wound her pride. He had simply opened the door to a room inside himself where grief still sat quietly in the corner, wearing his wife's name. Lily watched from the back table, her small hands folded over the satin napkin in her lap, her blue eyes fixed on her father with the solemn understanding of a child who had learned too early that love could leave but never disappear. Victoria swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt too small for a wound that deep. Ethan gave her a soft nod, the kind a good man gives when he has already forgiven someone before they ask. "You didn't know," he said. Then he turned away from the stage, not dramatically, not coldly, but with the quiet dignity of a man who refused to let his pain become a performance. As he walked back to Lily, the crowd parted without being asked. No one laughed now. No one reached for their phones. Even those who had arrived hoping to be seen by cameras suddenly seemed ashamed of wanting attention at all. Lily stood before he reached her and slipped her hand into his. "Can we go home, Daddy?" she asked softly. Ethan looked down at her, and for a moment his face changed. The strong man disappeared, and only the father remained. "Yeah, sweetheart," he murmured. "We can go home." Victoria watched them leave through the tall glass doors at the end of the ballroom, the gold light from the chandeliers fading behind them as they stepped into the cool evening air. Outside, New York hummed with traffic and sirens and the restless noise of people chasing lives they barely understood. Ethan helped Lily into his old silver pickup, parked between two black luxury SUVs belonging to men who had once believed themselves powerful. He buckled her seatbelt, shut the door gently, then stood for a second beneath the street lamp. In the reflected glass of the hotel entrance, he saw Victoria still standing inside the ballroom, alone in a sea of people. He could have gone back. A weaker man might have. A lonelier man might have. But Ethan had built his life on promises, and one promise still sat on the nightstand beside his bed in a thin silver frame. Emily Walker, smiling in a summer dress, one hand on her pregnant belly, unaware that cancer was already writing its final chapter. Ethan climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove away with his daughter leaning against the window. Behind him, Victoria Hayes stood in silence, realizing that the first man who had ever truly broken her heart was also the first man who had ever shown her what love was supposed to mean. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled because father and daughter had learned to understand each other without many words. Rain began tapping softly against the windshield as Ethan guided the aging pickup through the empty streets, the yellow glow of streetlights sliding across the dashboard in slow intervals. Lily hugged the small stuffed rabbit her mother had given her years before and finally spoke. "Daddy, did you hurt her?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road for several seconds before answering. "I hope not." Lily looked down at the rabbit's worn ears. She looked like she wanted to cry. Ethan's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the steering wheel. "Sometimes telling the truth still hurts people," he said gently, "but pretending would hurt them even more." Lily nodded, though she wasn't old enough to fully understand. When they reached their modest white farmhouse on the edge of town, the porch light automatically flickered on, just as it had every evening since Emily had insisted they install it, because she never wanted her family coming home to darkness. Ethan unlocked the front door, and the familiar scent of pine wood, cinnamon candles, and old books welcomed them inside. It wasn't a large house, but every corner carried memories that money could never replace. A framed family photograph rested on the fireplace mantel. Emily laughing while holding a 2-year-old Lily, Ethan standing behind them with grease-stained hands after finishing the treehouse he had built that very morning. Lily walked over to the photograph, as she always did before bedtime. She kissed 2 fingers and pressed them lightly against the glass. "Good night, Mommy," she whispered with innocent certainty. Ethan watched from the kitchen doorway, his heart performing the same painful ritual it had repeated every night for 8 years. After Lily disappeared upstairs, he remained standing in front of the photograph alone. "I almost let someone love me today," he admitted quietly, as though Emily could still hear him. "She deserves someone whose heart isn't divided." His eyes drifted toward the wedding band that still rested on his left hand. Many people had suggested he remove it. Friends had encouraged him to move on. Even his pastor had gently reminded him that grief was never meant to become a prison. Yet every time Ethan reached for the ring, he remembered the promise whispered beside Emily's hospital bed only hours before she slipped away. "Take care of our little girl," she had whispered, her voice barely stronger than the machines surrounding her. "Don't let her forget that she was born from love." He had nodded through tears, unable to promise anything else. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 10 times. Ethan turned off the living room lamp and looked once more at the smiling woman in the photograph before heading upstairs. Miles away, inside the top-floor penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Victoria Hayes stood barefoot beside the floor-to-ceiling windows without touching the untouched dinner waiting on the table. Her assistant had canceled tomorrow's meetings after seeing the expression on her face, but work was the last thing occupying her thoughts. She replayed Ethan's words over and over until she realized something that none of the guests at the gala had understood. He hadn't rejected her because she was a billionaire. He hadn't rejected her because he didn't admire her. He had rejected her because somewhere inside that quiet house, every night, a little girl still whispered, "Good night, Mommy," and one honorable man refused to betray the love that had built that home. Victoria Hayes had spent her entire career believing that every problem could be solved with enough determination, enough patience, or enough sacrifice. Yet 3 days after the charity gala, she found herself sitting in the corner office of Hayes Global Industries, staring at a city she no longer noticed, unable to solve the one question that mattered most. She had replayed Ethan Walker's words so many times that they no longer sounded like rejection. They sounded like devotion. It wasn't another woman standing between them. It was a promise. And somehow, that made him even more extraordinary. "Cancel the Aspen board retreat," she said quietly, without looking away from the window. Her executive assistant blinked in surprise. "The entire board is already flying in." "Victoria Nadif, reschedule it. Is something wrong?" After a long silence, Victoria answered with an honesty that startled even herself. "No, I think something is finally right." That afternoon, instead of boarding her private helicopter for another investor meeting, she drove alone in a simple gray SUV toward the small town where Ethan lived. She wore blue jeans, a light sweater, and no designer jewelry except the silver watch her late father had given her when she became CEO. She wasn't there to convince him to love her. She wasn't even sure why she had come. She only knew that for the first time in years, she wanted to understand someone's life instead of changing it. She parked across the street from Walker Auto Repair just before noon. The modest garage buzzed with the familiar sounds of impact wrenches, compressed air, and classic rock playing softly from an old radio perched on a dusty shelf. Ethan was beneath the hood of an aging Ford pickup, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, grease streaked across his forearms. He looked exactly as he always had, focused, calm, completely unaware that one of the richest women in America was watching him from across the street. Victoria remained inside her vehicle, resisting the urge to walk over. Then she noticed something that no magazine profile could have prepared her for. An elderly widow pulled into the garage, driving a faded Buick whose muffler rattled loudly. Ethan inspected the car, smiled kindly, and spent nearly 20 minutes repairing the loose exhaust. When the woman reached into her purse, he gently shook his head. "Not this time, Mrs. Donnelly," he said with a warm smile. "You already paid me with those blueberry pies last month." The elderly woman laughed, wiped away a grateful tear, and hugged him before driving away. Minutes later, a young delivery driver arrived with a flat tire, clearly panicked about missing work. Ethan fixed it immediately, charged him half the normal price, and quietly slipped $20 into the man's shirt pocket when he wasn't looking. The young father tried to return the money, but Ethan only smiled. "Buy your little boy some ice cream instead." Victoria felt her throat tighten. None of these acts were performed for attention. There were no cameras, no reporters, no social media posts celebrating generosity. Ethan simply lived the way other people wished to be remembered. She finally understood why Lily looked at her father with such complete trust. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He simply chose kindness every time no one was keeping score. As Victoria rested her forehead lightly against the steering wheel, one quiet realization settled into her heart with undeniable certainty. She had not fallen in love with the man who rejected her at the gala. She had fallen in love with the man he was every ordinary day when nobody was watching. Victoria drove away before Ethan could notice her, but the image of him refusing payment from an elderly widow lingered in her mind long after the garage disappeared in her rearview mirror. She realized she had spent years surrounded by people who measured success in stock prices, private jets, and magazine covers, while a man she could not stop thinking about measured his days by whether someone went home with a little more hope than they had arrived with. That evening, she skipped another black-tie dinner and instead found herself scrolling through old community newsletters online. Ethan's name appeared again and again, never in headlines, never in interviews, but buried in small stories that most people would overlook. He had rebuilt bicycles for children before Christmas. He had repaired a school bus without charging the district after a winter storm. He had quietly paid the utility bill for a family whose father had lost his job. No photographs accompanied the articles because Ethan always declined them. He says kindness isn't a performance, one local reporter had written years earlier. Victoria closed her laptop and leaned back, overwhelmed by a strange mixture of admiration and sorrow. The more she learned about Ethan Walker, the less she believed she deserved a place in his carefully protected world. Meanwhile, life at the garage continued exactly as it always had. Ethan opened the shop before sunrise, swept the floor, brewed cheap coffee, and greeted every customer by name. To everyone else, the charity gala had already become yesterday's news, but inside him the memory lingered. He had seen the tears in Victoria's eyes after his answer, and despite knowing he had done the honest thing, he carried a quiet ache that surprised him. Late Friday afternoon, as he was closing the hood of a customer's truck, Lily came skipping out of the small office carrying 2 paper cups of lemonade. "Break time," she declared with a grin. Ethan laughed softly and accepted one of the cups before sitting beside her on the wooden bench outside the garage. They watched the evening sun paint the fields in shades of amber while cars drifted past on the highway. After several minutes of comfortable silence, Lily looked up at him. "Daddy, do you think Mommy gets lonely?" Ethan nearly dropped his cup. "Why would you ask that?" Lily shrugged, tracing circles in the dust with the toe of her sneaker. "Because you look lonely sometimes. And if I can see it, maybe she can too." Ethan stared toward the horizon, unable to answer. His daughter had inherited Emily's gift for asking the questions adults tried hardest to avoid. "I miss her every day," he admitted quietly. "Me too," Lily whispered. Then she rested her head against his shoulder. "But missing someone doesn't mean you have to stop smiling." Ethan closed his eyes as emotion settled heavily in his chest. Those words sounded so much like Emily that for a fleeting second he could almost hear his late wife's gentle voice carried on the warm summer breeze. Miles away, Victoria sat alone on the balcony of her penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline, holding an untouched cup of tea. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with invitations, business updates, and messages from influential people wanting her attention. She ignored every one of them. Instead, she opened a blank contact on her phone where Ethan's number had remained unsaved since the gala. Her thumb hovered over the call button before slowly lowering again. "Not until he's ready," she whispered to herself. For the first time in her life, Victoria Hayes chose patience over pursuit, because somewhere deep inside, she was beginning to understand that real love was never something to be won. It was something that had to be trusted enough to arrive on its own. A week passed without a single message between them. Ethan returned to the steady rhythm of his ordinary life, convincing himself that the gala had simply been an unexpected chapter, now safely behind him. Victoria buried herself in work, but every board meeting, every acquisition, every congratulatory handshake felt strangely hollow. She had spent years building an empire, yet the quiet mechanic from a small-town garage had somehow become the measure by which she judged every meaningful thing. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, fate quietly intervened. Lily's elementary school hosted its annual Family Heritage Fair, a modest fundraiser where parents volunteered, local businesses donated supplies, and children proudly displayed projects about the people who had shaped their lives. Hayes Global Industries had sponsored the event for years through its Education Foundation, though Victoria had never attended personally. This year, without announcing her visit, she arrived alone carrying nothing more than a simple bouquet of white daisies for the school principal. No cameras followed. No assistants walked behind her. She wanted one afternoon where she could simply be another guest. Across the gymnasium, Ethan was helping a group of children assemble wooden birdhouses, patiently showing them how to hold a hammer without striking their fingers. Lily stood nearby with paint-covered hands, laughing as bright blue streaks found their way onto Ethan's old flannel shirt. Victoria watched from a distance, smiling before she even realized it. She had seen Ethan repair engines, comfort strangers, and walk away from the woman who loved him rather than betray his conscience. But seeing him surrounded by children revealed another side of him entirely. He listened before he spoke. He encouraged without praising too much. He corrected mistakes without making anyone feel small. It was the kind of father every child deserved. Lily suddenly noticed Victoria standing near the entrance. Without hesitation, she ran across the gym. "Miss Victoria," she called happily. Ethan looked up, surprise flashing across his face as their eyes met for the first time since the gala. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria knelt to Lily's height. "Hi there," she said warmly. "Your birdhouse looks beautiful." Lily beamed. "Daddy says birds need safe homes too." Victoria glanced toward Ethan, who offered an almost apologetic smile before walking over. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said quietly. "Neither did I," Victoria admitted with a gentle laugh. The awkwardness that had haunted their last meeting slowly softened beneath the cheerful noise of children filling the gym. Before either adult could search for another sentence, Lily reached out and took both of their hands at once. "Come see my project," she insisted. Neither of them had the heart to refuse. She led them to a display board covered with family photographs, crayon drawings, and carefully printed words. At the top, in large colorful letters, it read, "My hero." Victoria expected to see only Ethan's picture. Instead, there were two photographs side by side. One showed Ethan lifting Lily onto his shoulders during a county fair. The other showed Emily Walker smiling brightly beneath a summer sky. Underneath, Lily had written in careful handwriting, "My mommy taught me what love feels like. My daddy teaches me how to keep giving it away." Victoria felt tears gather before she could stop them. Beside her, Ethan stood perfectly still, staring at his daughter's words as though seeing them for the first time himself. In that quiet school gymnasium filled with children's laughter, both of them realized the same truth. Emily Walker's love had never been the wall separating their hearts. It had become the bridge teaching them what real love was supposed to look like. The drive home from the school was quieter than usual, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer weighed down by sorrow alone. It carried questions Ethan had spent years refusing to ask himself. Lily sat in the passenger seat with the ribbon she had won at the Heritage Fair resting across her lap, absent-mindedly tracing the gold lettering with her fingertips. The late afternoon sun broke through the rain clouds, casting warm streaks of light across the windshield. After several miles, Lily spoke without taking her eyes off the ribbon. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy would like Miss Victoria?" Ethan smiled faintly, caught off guard by the question. "Why do you ask?" Lily shrugged. "Because she listened when I talked. Most grown-ups smile and then look somewhere else. She didn't." Ethan remembered the way Victoria had knelt to Lily's height, the genuine warmth in her eyes, and how naturally she had laughed with the children instead of trying to impress the adults. "I think your mom would have respected anyone who was kind," he answered carefully. Lily nodded as though that settled something important. "I like her," she whispered, "but I don't want anyone to replace Mommy." Ethan reached across the seat and gently squeezed her hand at the next red light. "No one ever could," he said. "Not for either of us." That evening, after Lily had gone upstairs, Ethan found himself standing once again before Emily's photograph. It had become a habit over the years, speaking aloud to the woman whose absence still shaped every decision he made. "She met Lily today," he said quietly. "And?" Lily smiled the whole afternoon. His eyes drifted to the wedding band that had remained on his finger for 8 long years. For the first time, he noticed something he had never allowed himself to consider. He wasn't holding onto the ring because Emily had asked him to. She never had. He was holding onto it because he was afraid that moving forward might somehow mean loving her less. The realization settled over him with unexpected force. Across the city, Victoria sat in the library of her penthouse, not reading the open book resting in her lap. Instead, she kept thinking about Lily's project. "My daddy teaches me how to keep giving love away." Those words refused to leave her heart. She understood now that Ethan's greatest strength wasn't his loyalty to the past. It was his ability to keep loving in the present despite carrying unimaginable loss. She opened a drawer and removed the elegant silver bracelet she had planned to give Lily after the school event. Smiling sadly, she closed the box again. "Not yet," she murmured. "Love isn't proven with gifts." Over the next several days, Victoria made a decision that surprised everyone around her. She stopped finding reasons to visit the garage. She stopped driving past Ethan's house. She even declined invitations that she knew would place them in the same room. It wasn't because her feelings had faded. They had only grown stronger. But she finally understood that if Ethan ever walked toward her, it had to be because his own heart was ready, not because she had patiently worn down his defenses. And somewhere deep inside Ethan Walker, a quiet change had already begun. For the first time since Emily's passing, when he imagined the future, he no longer saw only himself and Lily. He caught fleeting glimpses of someone else standing beside them, not replacing the love they had lost, but gently adding a new chapter to the story that Emily herself had begun. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees around Ethan's farmhouse in shades of amber and crimson. The mornings grew colder, and every Saturday had settled into a familiar routine. Ethan would close the garage at noon. Lily would insist on baking cinnamon cookies using her mother's old recipe, and the little white farmhouse would fill with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. It was on one of those quiet Saturdays, while searching the attic for winter blankets, that Lily discovered a weathered cedar box tucked behind an old rocking chair. Dust covered the lid, but the tiny brass clasp still gleamed beneath the afternoon light. "Daddy," she called. "What's this?" Ethan climbed the attic stairs, and the moment he saw the box, his breath caught. He hadn't opened it since the week after Emily's funeral. Kneeling beside Lily, he brushed away the dust with trembling fingers before slowly lifting the lid. Inside lay photographs, hospital bracelets, Lily's newborn footprints, pressed wildflowers from their wedding day, and dozens of handwritten letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Emily had labeled each envelope with careful script: for Lily's 10th birthday, for her first heartbreak, for graduation, for her wedding day. Ethan smiled through gathering tears, remembering how Emily had prepared letters for every milestone she feared she might never witness. At the very bottom rested one final envelope he had somehow never noticed before. Unlike the others, it carried only his name. "For Ethan, when you're finally ready." His hands shook as he unfolded the letter. Emily's handwriting was instantly familiar, graceful and steady despite the illness she had hidden between every line. "My love," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've already kept every promise that truly mattered. You gave our daughter a home filled with kindness. You taught her that grief can live beside laughter. You carried both of us longer than I ever wanted you to. But sweetheart, if you're still wearing your ring because you think that's what I needed from you, then you've misunderstood my greatest wish. Loving someone else will never erase me. Love doesn't replace love. It makes room for more of it. If one day a woman looks at you with the same honesty you once looked at me, please don't send her away because of my memory. Let my memory be the reason you open your heart again, not the reason you close it forever. Promise me one last thing. When happiness finally knocks on your door, don't make it stand outside in the cold." Ethan lowered the letter, unable to speak as tears slipped freely down his face. Across from him, Lily quietly wrapped her small arms around his shoulders. She had not read every word, but she had seen enough. "Mommy knew," she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly, overwhelmed by a truth that had waited 8 long years to find him. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed softly through the house. The same house that had once felt like a monument to loss now seemed to breathe differently, as though Emily herself had finally given them permission to live again. Hundreds of miles away, Victoria stood alone outside a children's hospital after quietly funding an anonymous expansion of its pediatric wing. She smiled as young families walked through the entrance, never knowing who had paid for the new building. Yet even in that beautiful moment, her thoughts drifted to Ethan. She closed her eyes, whispered a silent prayer for the man she loved, and turned to leave, never imagining that at that very same moment, the woman who had first captured Ethan Walker's heart had gently, lovingly, and finally set it free. 3 weeks later, the first snow of the season drifted quietly over the town, covering rooftops, fences, and empty fields with a blanket of white that made everything feel new. Ethan stood outside Walker Auto Repair after locking the garage for the evening, watching Lily laugh as she tried to catch snowflakes on her mittened hands. For the first time in years, the weight inside his chest no longer felt like an anchor. Emily's letter rested safely in the inside pocket of his coat, close enough that he could almost feel her hand resting over his heart. He reached into his wallet and looked at a small business card that had remained there since the charity gala. It simply read, Victoria Hayes. Beneath the number, she had once scribbled a sentence with a smile. If you ever decide coffee is less frightening than a board meeting, call me. Ethan stared at the card for several seconds before slipping it back into his pocket. Lily, he said softly. She looked up. Would you mind if we made one more stop before going home? Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. Is it somewhere nice? Ethan smiled. I hope so. Nearly an hour later, his old silver pickup pulled quietly to the curb outside a small neighborhood cafe in Manhattan. It wasn't luxurious, and that was exactly why Victoria loved coming there whenever she wanted to disappear from the world. She sat alone by the window, reading a novel she had turned the same page for nearly 20 minutes. The bell above the cafe door chimed gently. She glanced up without thinking and forgot how to breathe. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, snow melting from his coat, Lily beside him holding a paper bag that smelled unmistakably of homemade cinnamon cookies. For a long moment, neither adult moved. The cafe around them faded into a blur of warm lights, soft jazz, and murmured conversations. Finally, Ethan walked toward her. Victoria. His voice was exactly as she remembered, quiet, steady, and honest. She slowly stood, afraid that if she blinked he might disappear. Ethan. He took a slow breath before speaking again. I've spent a long time believing that moving forward meant leaving. Someone behind. He paused, his fingers briefly touching the folded letter inside his coat. I finally realized love doesn't work that way. Victoria's eyes filled with tears before he could finish. Ethan smiled, not the polite smile he offered strangers, but the genuine one that reached his eyes. If your invitation is still open, he said, I'd like to take you to dinner. Victoria laughed through her tears, covering her mouth for a moment before nodding. I was beginning to think you'd never ask. Before either of them could say another word, Lily stepped forward with the paper bag. These are Mommy's cinnamon cookies, she said shyly. Daddy and I made them together. We thought, maybe you'd like to share them with us. Victoria knelt until she was eye level with the little girl. I would love that. Lily smiled, then did something neither adult expected. She gently took Victoria's hand and placed it inside Ethan's before stepping back with the quiet confidence only a child could possess. Ethan looked down at their joined hands but did not pull away. Instead, his fingers slowly closed around hers. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering old footprints while leaving room for new ones. Somewhere beyond the winter sky, the memory of Emily Walker no longer felt like a goodbye. It felt like a blessing carried gently on the wind, reminding them all that the deepest love is never measured by how tightly we hold on to yesterday, but by having the courage to welcome tomorrow. And as the three of them walked out of the cafe together into the softly falling snow, no one saw a billionaire CEO or a struggling single father anymore. They saw what had been there all along. Three hearts choosing grace over fear, second chances over regret, and a future built not on replacing the past, but on honoring it with love.